Imagine a world where a mere scratch, a slight fever, or a toothache could lead to death, where a mosquito bite could prove a mortal threat. In this world, medicine was intertwined with prayers, superstitions, and bloodletting. This was not a figment of imagination. This was the reality of ancient Rome and ancient Greece. We shall embark on a journey into the era of silent horrors that plagued the great Mediterranean civilizations. The reader will discover that people perished not only by the sword, but also from more merciless, invisible, and pervasive factors. Realizing this allows us to reevaluate such commonplace things as soap, dental services, and penicillin. Imagine that reaching the age of 30 was considered remarkably fortunate. Mothers knew that many of their children would not even take their first steps, and warriors returning from battle rarely lived to a ripe old age. Such was the reality of ancient Rome and classical Greece. The average life expectancy at birth in these civilizations ranged from 21 to 25 years. This figure does not mean that everyone died young, but rather reflects a horrifying reality. Infant mortality was catastrophic. Almost a third of Roman infants died before reaching their first birthday. The situation in Greece was similar, and in some rural areas, even worse. Childhood was not a given, but rather a harsh trial that few managed to survive. There were no incubators, vaccines, or antibiotics. A common cold could be a death sentence. The dispassionate statistics of antiquity paint a bleak picture of a world where life was fragile and short-lived. Archaeological excavations reveal a sad fact. Graves of Roman infants with headstones are extremely rare. This circumstance led researchers to believe that the constant loss of offspring compelled parents to erect emotional barriers to avoid profound grief. Love was undoubtedly present, but it was marred by the fear of inevitable loss. Beyond the vulnerability of childhood, women faced yet another deadly trial: childbirth. In an era when cesarean sections, anesthesia, and antiseptics were unknown, giving birth became a gamble with death. Many women perished after giving birth to their second or third child, and those who survived rarely lived past the age of 38. Maternal mortality was undoubtedly one of the primary causes of these silent deaths. Men, in turn, were destined for warfare, arduous physical labor, and unnamed illnesses. They fell victim to infections, carelessly treated wounds, lead poisoning from water pipes, or sudden fevers. Peasants who managed to live to half a century were universally revered and considered long-lived. However, death did not always come quickly. Many suffered from illnesses for years, deprived of skilled medical care and palliative care, without understanding what was draining their life force. Medicine was in its infancy, still influenced by magical and religious beliefs, where illness could be perceived as divine punishment. From the vantage point of modern civilization, such a reality seems a true nightmare. Yet, it was precisely in these harsh conditions that the greatest philosophical, scientific, and artistic ideas in human history were born. It seems as though humanity, teetering on the brink of an abyss, developed its spiritual potential while its physical shell was surrounded by death. Mortality in ancient times was a ubiquitous phenomenon, a constant reminder of its presence. And perhaps, this is why today, from the height of more than 2 millennia, it is worth looking back to realize. To live for over 70 years, with access to clean drinking water, vaccines, modern hospitals, and even such a simple item as a toothbrush, is not commonplace, but the greatest privilege. In the era of the Roman Empire and ancient Greece, falling ill meant taking the first step towards an inevitable demise. In the absence of antibiotics, vaccinations, and effective hygiene standards, any, even minor, infection could prove fatal. And the most terrifying aspect was that the enemy was invisible, devoid of form or shape, and, most importantly, incurable. Despite the Romans being pioneers in using aqueducts and complex sewage systems, water quality remained uncontrolled and untreated. Water flowed into homes, but with it came sediment, pathogenic microorganisms, and dangerous bacteria. Thus, the source of life often became a harbinger of severe illnesses. Rome boasted an impressive sewage system, known as the Cloaca Maxima. However, sanitary measures were more aesthetic than functional. The primary goal was to conceal unpleasant odors, not to eliminate pathogens. Public latrines, while a significant advancement compared to other civilizations, were breeding grounds for mass infections, where many people used the same space without any sanitary protection whatsoever. Added to this were dangerous customs that seem utterly unthinkable in the modern world. The use of human excrement as fertilizer, shared bathwater for several days without changing it, and living amidst filth, dampness, and uncontrolled animals. All of this created an ideal environment for the proliferation of intestinal parasites, enteric fevers, bacterial infections, and a multitude of other, sometimes even unnamed, diseases. Among the extensive list of invisible threats that undermine the lives and well-being of people in antiquity, malaria stood out, like a malevolent fate hanging over the Mediterranean. This disease was firmly entrenched in many areas of the Roman Empire. The city of Rome and other significant settlements were surrounded by marshy areas, which served as ideal breeding grounds for Anopheles mosquitoes, carriers of the deadly parasite. In the absence of insect repellents, protective netting, and basic knowledge about the mechanisms of infection spread, people faced fevers that suddenly struck the body, ravaged it, and often proved fatal. Archaeological findings, particularly hundreds of child burials from the 5th century, attest to high mortality from malaria. According to historical sources, even Alaric, the Visigoth king who sacked Rome in 410 AD, died shortly thereafter, having contracted the disease during his stay in Italy. Malaria not only claimed lives, but also weakened the population, depriving thousands of their strength and ability to work. Some researchers hypothesize that the prolonged impact of malaria may have contributed to the decline of the Roman Empire, gradually weakening its demographic and military potential. Alongside malaria, tuberculosis caused significant damage to public health. Paleopathological studies reveal characteristic changes in the spine, as well as signs of lung damage. In an era when large families commonly lived together in cramped and poorly ventilated dwellings, the risk of tuberculosis infection was extremely high. In those distant times, humanity lived surrounded by invisible ailments, unable to identify them or understand their mechanisms of spread. People simply observed the fact. A neighbor fell victim to illness and passed away. A child burned with fever and never opened their eyes again. A spouse lost strength and never recovered. Such was the everyday reality even for the most enlightened inhabitants of antiquity. They accepted this with unwavering stoicism, fueled by superstition and fear, but above all, with a degree of endurance that is difficult for modern people to imagine. Ancient Rome, whose civilization left an indelible mark on history, captures the imagination with its architectural and technological achievements. However, amidst all this splendor, a hidden threat lurked, an insidious killer that for centuries subtly infiltrated the bodies of Romans, poisoning their lives drop by drop: lead. In an era when toxicology as a science did not yet exist, the Romans discovered that this malleable metal was ideal for many practical applications. It was impervious to corrosion, easily worked, and abundant in nature. As a result, lead found widespread use, from water pipes and cooking utensils to cosmetics, coins, medicines, and even as a sweetener for wine. The irony of fate was that what was meant to bring joy and relief slowly, but surely poisoned their bodies. The human body is a complex system, susceptible to environmental influences. Scientific research conducted at the University of Minnesota revealed a startling fact. The bone remains of ancient Romans contained 10 times more lead than those of modern humans. considering the predilection of the upper classes for daily consumption of up to 3 liters of wine, stored in amphorae treated internally with lead compounds, a grim picture emerges. This imperceptible but dangerous poison did not lead to instant death. Its action was more insidious and merciless. It affected the central nervous system, triggering behavioral deviations, visual and auditory hallucinations, memory impairment, constant fatigue, reproductive dysfunction, kidney failure, and, ultimately, relentless physical and intellectual exhaustion. Some historians explain the eccentric behavior and irrational actions of Roman rulers, such as Caligula and Nero, as consequences of chronic lead poisoning. This heavy metal was also an ingredient in cosmetics used by aristocratic women, medicinal ointments, and even theatrical makeup. Avoiding its effects was virtually impossible. From bathing to wine consumption, Rome was saturated with lead, and no one realized the impending danger. However, the impact of lead was not limited to neurological disorders. It weakened the body's immune defenses, making people more susceptible to various infections. And even if poisoning did not directly prove fatal, it insidiously eroded the health of many generations. Was lead one of the factors that determined the downfall of the great Roman Empire? A number of historians lean towards an affirmative answer, believing that a state whose ruling circles, intellectual elite, and warriors were gradually being poisoned was doomed to decay from within. By tragic irony, in their pursuit of sophistication, purity, and progress, the Romans chose an insidious enemy, one of the most poisonous elements. Lead, which granted them power, surreptitiously drained their vitality. In an era when anesthesia, dental fillings, and toothbrushes were unavailable, pain afflicted virtually every Greek and Roman. At first glance, this might seem insignificant compared to such scourges as plague or malaria. However, anyone who has experienced an agonizing toothache knows that it can turn life into an absolute hell. The Roman diet, especially for the poor, consisted almost entirely of wheat bread. This bread was typically dense, unleavened, and often made from flour ground in millstones that left particles of sand and dust in it. As a result, every piece of bread became an abrasive, ruthlessly eroding tooth enamel. Over time, molars wore down, cracked, and eventually disintegrated. The absence of basic oral hygiene was ubiquitous. Toothpaste and mouthwashes were non-existent as a concept. Some attempted to clean their teeth using crushed eggshells, charcoal, or even fermented urine. Paradoxically, such whitening often only exacerbated infectious processes. In those distant times, when tooth decay mercilessly attacked teeth, there was virtually no hope of salvation. A common dental abscess could rapidly escalate into a dangerous infection, penetrating bone tissue, deforming the jaw, and ultimately leading to death from sepsis. Archaeological finds attest to numerous cases of disfigured jaws resulting from virulent infections. Research indicates that most adult Romans lost a significant number of teeth even before death, often before reaching the age of 40. Thus, toothache was a constant and inseparable companion, a daily torment, and an incurable nightmare for ancient people. The only recourse in this excruciating situation was often tooth extraction, performed without any anesthesia. This procedure was so brutal and barbaric that many preferred to face death rather than endure it. Among the upper classes, some healers attempted to experiment with herbal infusions, mandrake extract, and opium. However, these remedies did not bring healing, but merely dulled the unbearable suffering for a short time. In some cases, bloodletting was also employed, with the naive belief that draining blood could alleviate pain. As a result, the population lived in an atmosphere of silent suffering, enduring torment without excessive complaint. As in the ancient world, pain was not considered unusual, but rather a commonplace and accustomed phenomenon.